The final box was the worst. It wasn't heavy, but it held the ghosts of a life I no longer had. A small collection of my wife Eleanor's porcelain birds, a framed photo of our son David's college graduation, and my father's old worn leather-bound copy of Leaves of Grass. I placed it on the stained linoleum floor of the one-bedroom apartment that smelled of stale cigarettes and defeat. This was my new home. A 70-year-old man, starting over in a place smaller than the garage of the house I had built with my own 2 hands. 3 months ago, I had a life. I had a loving wife of 45 years, a successful construction business I'd built from the ground up, a beautiful home, and a nest egg worth over $4 million. Then, Eleanor got sick. The decline was fast, brutal, and it shattered my world. In the fog of my grief, my son David and his wife Melissa, a lawyer and a CPA, stepped in. They were so helpful, so concerned. "Let us handle the paperwork, Dad," David had said, his face a perfect mask of sorrow. "You need to focus on Mom." They brought me stacks of documents, explaining they were for hospital administration, for estate planning, for making things easier down the road. In my days, I signed where they told me to sign. I trusted them. He was my son. She was family. I never read the fine print. That was the mistake that cost me everything. This is my true story. They told me I was signing medical directives, but I was actually signing away my life. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. 2 weeks after I buried my wife, they sat me down in my own living room and explained the documents I had signed. A durable power of attorney. A transfer of assets into a management trust they controlled. They told me my grief had made me incapable of managing my own affairs. They said it was for my own good. The business, the house, the savings, my pension. It was all legally, irrevocably, theirs. They sold my business, the one that bore my name, for pennies on the dollar to a holding company they owned. They sold my home, the one where every room held a memory of Eleanor. They gave me a small allowance and moved me into this shoebox, telling me it was more manageable for a man your age. They had stripped me bare with a smile and a signature. Now, I sat on the floor of this sterile, lonely apartment, the silence broken only by the hum of the ancient refrigerator. I had nothing left but memories. I opened the box of ghosts and began to unpack, my movements slow, my joints aching with a weariness that went far beyond my years. My hand brushed against something small and hard at the bottom of the box. I pulled it out. It was a small, tarnished brass key, attached to a faded paper tag. The tag read, First National Bank, Safety Deposit Box 317. I didn't recognize it. It must have been my father's. He passed away 30 years ago. I had cleared out his house myself, but this box, this key, I had no memory of it. A flicker of something, not quite hope, but a dull curiosity, stirred in my gut. It was probably empty, full of old papers, maybe my dad's service medals. But it was something. A loose thread in the suffocating blanket of my new reality. I clutched the key in my hand, the cold metal a small, solid point in a world that had become fluid and treacherous. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go to the bank. I had nothing to lose. I had already lost it all. They thought they had buried me. They thought they had erased me from my own life. But they had forgotten that I am my father's son, a builder. And a builder knows that even in the deepest rubble, if you can find one solid piece of foundation, you can start to rebuild. This little brass key, forgotten for decades, felt like the cornerstone I had been praying for. The next morning, I put on my only remaining suit, a garment that hung on my now thinner frame, a relic from a life of boardroom meetings and anniversary dinners. Walking into the grand marble-floored lobby of the First National Bank felt like a betrayal. This was the bank that had given me my first business loan, the bank where I knew the managers by name. Now, I felt like a beggar, clutching a strange, old key, my pockets empty. I was directed to a stern-faced woman in wealth management who looked at my faded tag with skepticism. "Box 317, she said, typing into her computer. "That's one of our oldest accounts. The rental fees have been auto-drafting from a legacy account for, good heavens, since 1950. She led me into the vault, a vast, silent room of polished steel and hushed importance. The air was cool and still. She located the box, a small, unassuming drawer in a wall of identical drawers. It required 2 keys to open, hers and mine. I inserted my father's key into the lock. The brass felt warm against the cold steel. The lock turned with a satisfying, solid click. She pulled out a long, metal box and placed it on a viewing table in a small, private room. "Take your time, Mr. Miller," she said, and closed the door behind her, leaving me alone with the ghosts of the past. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. The box was not full of papers. It was lined with faded velvet, and nestled inside were stacks of what looked like old ornate certificates, tied in bundles with faded red ribbon. United States war bonds. Dozens of them. Most were Series E bonds, purchased between 1941 and 1945. My father, a man who had scrimped and saved his entire life, had poured his money into the war effort. A quick mental calculation told me the face value was significant, maybe $10,000 or $20,000. With 70 years of accrued interest, it could be a small fortune. Enough to live on, at least. Enough to escape the suffocating walls of that grim apartment. A wave of relief, so powerful it made me dizzy, washed over me. But beneath the bonds, there was something else. A sealed, yellowed envelope. I carefully broke the brittle wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a note in my father's familiar, strong handwriting. The note was short. "Frank," it read, "if you are reading this, it means the world has gone sideways. The bonds are for emergencies. But the real security isn't in the paper. It's in the foundation. Remember the name, Alistair Finch. He was my wartime counsel. He set up the contingency trust. He holds the plans. The contingency trust. Alistair Finch. The words meant nothing to me. But foundation, that was a word I understood. My father was a builder, too. He wasn't talking about money. He was talking about something deeper, something structural. I gathered the bonds and the note, my mind racing. I went back out to the bank manager, my heart pounding with a new kind of energy. "I need to know the current value of these bonds," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "And I need you to look up a name for me. Alistair Finch. An attorney. He would have been a customer here." The manager took one of the bonds, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the dates. He disappeared for what felt like an hour. When he returned, he was with a younger, sharper-looking man who introduced himself as Mr. Davies, the branch president. "Mr. Miller," Davies said, his face pale and his voice hushed with awe. "We've run the serial numbers. These bonds, they have been accruing interest for over 70 years. The total value is substantial." He slid a printout across the desk to me. I looked at the number at the bottom of the page. It wasn't a small fortune. It was a staggering one. Several $100,000. But then he pointed to something else on the page. "But that's not the most interesting part, sir. The original purchase order for this block of bonds was tied to a secondary instrument. A trust. According to our digital archives of the old paper records, it's called the Miller Family Contingency Trust. It was established in 1950. Davies turned his monitor towards me. On the screen was a scanned, black-and-white document, the original trust filing. "Alastair Finch is long gone, of course," Davies said. "But his firm, Finch, Sutton and Pierce, still exists. And according to this, they are the administrators of the trust." He zoomed in on the screen, and my breath caught in my throat. What I saw wasn't just text. It was a list of assets the trust held. And the first item on that list, the core asset that the trust was built to protect, made my blood run cold. It was the deed to a single parcel of land. The very first piece of land my father ever bought. The land where I built my first workshop. The land on which the headquarters of Miller Construction, my company, my legacy, now stood. The company my son had just stolen from me. The revelation that my father's trust still held the deed to the land my company was built on sent a shockwave through me. It didn't make sense. I owned that land. It was the cornerstone of my business assets, the very ground on which my life's work stood. Or so I thought. I left the bank in a daze, the printout of the trust document clutched in my hand, the heavy weight of the war bonds in my briefcase. The world, which had been a bleak, monochrome landscape of loss, was suddenly filled with sharp, confusing colors. My son, David, the lawyer, had overseen the transfer of all my assets. He had assured me everything was now under his control. Could he have missed this? Could a dusty, 70-year-old trust, hidden in a forgotten safety deposit box, have slipped past a man as meticulous and predatory as my son? The next morning, I walked into the downtown offices of Finch, Sutton and Pierce. The firm was no longer the small practice my father would have known. It was a modern, glass and steel behemoth, radiating power and wealth. I felt small and insignificant as I approached the receptionist, but I clutched the name from my father's note like a talisman. I didn't ask for a partner. I asked for Alastair Finch's files. My request, coupled with my age and my old, ill-fitting suit, earned me a dismissive look. But when I produced the original trust document from the bank and mentioned the Miller Family Contingency Trust, the atmosphere changed. I was ushered into a small, book-lined conference room. A few minutes later, a young woman entered. She was sharp, in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Mr. Miller," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Sarah Pierce. Alastair Finch was my grandfather." Hope, a real and potent force, surged through me. This was a direct link. I laid out my story, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I told her about Eleanor, about my grief, about David and Melissa's betrayal. I showed her the power of attorney I had foolishly signed. And then I showed her the trust document and my father's note. She listened intently, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to a focused, almost predatory intensity. She took the trust document and read it, her eyes scanning the dense, archaic legal language. "Your father was a very, very smart man, Mr. Miller," she said, a note of admiration in her voice. "This is an ironclad instrument. A fortress. It was designed for one purpose, to protect the foundational asset of the family from all creditors, all lawsuits, and all forms of transfer, voluntary or involuntary, except under a very specific set of circumstances." She explained that my father didn't technically own the land. The trust owned it. I had been granted what was called a lifetime tenancy, giving me the right to use the land for my business as if it were my own. Upon my death, that tenancy would pass to my heir. David wouldn't have seen this, she explained. When he did a title search on your assets, he would have seen your name as the lifetime tenant. He would have assumed that gave you, and therefore him via the power of attorney, the right to dispose of the property. But he didn't dig deep enough. He didn't find the root charter of the trust. My heart hammered in my chest. So, what does this mean? Sarah leaned forward, a grim smile on her face. It means that when your son used your power of attorney to transfer all your assets, including Miller Construction, to his holding company, he didn't actually transfer the most valuable piece, the land. He only transferred the buildings, the equipment, and the name. The ground they all sit on still belongs to your father's trust. And you, she said, tapping the document, are its sole beneficiary and protector. The sheer, beautiful irony of it was stunning. My son, the brilliant lawyer, so arrogant in his modern, complex legal maneuvering, had been outsmarted by his grandfather, a simple builder from a half-century in the past. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out her laptop. Let's see what your son has been up to with the company he thinks he owns. With a few clicks, she pulled up the public filings for Miller Construction and the holding company David and Melissa had created, a shell corporation called D&M Holdings. We saw a flurry of recent activity. They were systematically stripping Miller Construction of its assets. Trucks sold. Equipment auctioned off. Contracts cancelled. They're gutting it, I whispered, a fresh wave of rage washing over me. They weren't just taking my money, they were desecrating my legacy. They're liquidating everything, Sarah agreed, her eyes narrowed. But why? This is inefficient. They're selling valuable assets for pennies on the dollar. It looks desperate. She kept digging, cross-referencing corporate records, and then she found it. A pending application for a new luxury real estate development project, filed by D&M Holdings. A massive, $100 million high-rise condo complex. This is the endgame, she said, pointing to the screen. They're not interested in your construction company. They're cashing it out to fund their own dream project. They're using your life's work as seed money for theirs. And then she saw something that made her stop. A pending loan application. To secure the massive financing for the condo project, they needed to put up significant collateral. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, she breathed, leaning closer to the screen. They're so arrogant, they didn't even think to hide it. She turned the laptop to face me. On the screen was the preliminary collateral statement for a $10 million bridge loan. And listed as the primary asset being leveraged against the loan was the physical land itself, the parcel of land at 1250 Industrial Way. The land that Miller Construction stood on. The land they didn't own. The sight of that loan application, with my land pledged as collateral by my own son, ignited a fire in my soul. The grief and defeat that had clouded my mind for months burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp-edged fury. David wasn't just a thief, he was a fool. An arrogant, reckless fool who was so sure of his own genius that he never imagined his Depression-era grandfather could have laid a trap for him from across the decades. He's committed bank fraud, hasn't he? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. He's knowingly misrepresented his ownership of an asset to secure a loan. He's about to, Sarah corrected, her eyes gleaming with a strategist's light. This is just the preliminary application. The loan hasn't been funded yet. The lien hasn't been filed. He's walking towards a cliff in the dark, and we have the power to either yell and warn him, or to let him take that final step." I looked at her, and she saw the answer in my eyes. There would be no warnings. "My father's note," I said, remembering the last line. "He said you, his lawyer, holds the plans." What did he mean? Sarah smiled. "My grandfather was meticulous. He believed in contingencies for his contingencies. The trust document is the what. The plans are the how." She went to a heavy, fireproof filing cabinet in the corner of her office and retrieved a dusty, leather-bound binder. The cover was embossed with the words, "Miller Family Contingency Trust, Operational Protocols." My grandfather believed that legal documents were only as strong as the strategy used to enforce them, she said, laying the binder on the table. It was a step-by-step playbook, written by my father and Alistair Finch, for exactly this kind of scenario. It was a manual for my revenge. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. The trust contained a poison pill clause, a provision so deeply buried in the legalese that only a paranoid or incredibly diligent attorney would find it. The clause stated that if any party, including the lifetime tenant, attempted to use the land as collateral for any purpose other than the direct operational needs of the primary family business, Miller Construction, or attempted to sell it, then two things would happen automatically. First, the lifetime tenancy would be immediately and irrevocably terminated. Second, all assets, buildings, and chattel currently on the land would be forfeited to the trust itself. "Your son thinks he's borrowing against the land," Sarah explained, her voice humming with excitement. "But the moment that loan is funded and the bank files a lien, he won't just lose the right to the land. According to this, he will forfeit the entire company. The buildings, the remaining equipment, the company name, everything reverts to the trust. He will have committed bank fraud to secure a loan against an asset he doesn't own, and in the process, he will lose the very company he stole. It's a perfect, self-destructing trap." For the next week, we prepared for war, following the playbook to the letter. First, I had to maintain my cover. I had to remain the broken, defeated old man. I accidentally ran into David one afternoon near his opulent downtown office. I played the part perfectly, looking frail, confused, asking him if he could spare a few dollars for groceries. He was dismissive, annoyed, peeling a 20 from his wallet and pressing it into my hand with a sigh of condescending pity. "Take care of yourself, Dad," he'd said before striding away, confident that I was no threat. That $20 bill felt like a declaration of war. I taped it to the wall of my apartment as a reminder of his arrogance. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly. She prepared a series of legal filings, ready to be executed at a moment's notice. A petition to the court to affirm the trust's ownership of the land. A cease and desist letter to the bank that was issuing the loan. And a comprehensive complaint to be filed with the State Bar Association, detailing David's fraudulent conversion of my assets and his ethical violations. She also engaged a forensic accountant to trace the money. We needed to know exactly where every dollar from my life savings and the liquidation of my company had gone. The accountant's report came back 2 days later, and it was even worse than I had imagined. David and Melissa hadn't just put the money in their bank account. They had gone on a breathtaking spending spree. A new vacation home in Aspen. A Lamborghini for him, a Tesla for her. Lavish trips. Designer clothes. They had burned through nearly $500,000 of my life's work in a matter of weeks, all while their father and father-in-law was living in a slum. The final piece of the plan was the war bonds. We cashed them out. The final sum was just over $350,000. It wasn't the millions they had stolen, but it was the seed money for my comeback. It was my father's final gift, the war chest for the battle ahead. I didn't deposit it into a normal bank account. On Sarah's advice, I used it to establish a new legal entity, a trust of my own, shielded from any possible legal attacks from David. We were building a new fortress while he was busy decorating a palace built on a sinkhole. A week after my meeting with Sarah, her contact at the loan underwriting department called. "It's done," the contact said. D&M Holdings has been approved for the $10 million bridge loan. The paperwork has been signed. We're funding it and filing the UCC lien against the property tomorrow morning. The bait had been taken. The trap was about to spring. Sarah looked at me across her conference table. "It's time, Frank," she said, her voice steady. "Tomorrow morning, your son is going to have the worst day of his life." The sight of that loan application, with my land pledged as collateral by my own son, ignited a fire in my soul. The grief and defeat that had clouded my mind for months burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp-edged fury. David wasn't just a thief. He was a fool. An arrogant, reckless fool who was so sure of his own genius that he never imagined his Depression-era grandfather could have laid a trap for him from across the decades. "He's committed bank fraud, hasn't he?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "He's knowingly misrepresented his ownership of an asset to secure a loan." "He's about to," Sarah corrected, her eyes gleaming with a strategist's light. "This is just the preliminary application. The loan hasn't been funded yet. The lien hasn't been filed. He's walking towards a cliff in the dark, and we have the power to either yell and warn him, or to let him take that final step." I looked at her, and she saw the answer in my eyes. There would be no warnings. "My father's note," I said, remembering the last line. "He said you, his lawyer, holds the plans." What did he mean? Sarah smiled. "My grandfather was meticulous. He believed in contingencies for his contingencies. The trust document is the what. The plans are the how." She went to a heavy, fireproof filing cabinet in the corner of her office and retrieved a dusty, leather-bound binder. The cover was embossed with the words, "Miller Family Contingency Trust, Operational Protocols." My grandfather believed that legal documents were only as strong as the strategy used to enforce them, she said, laying the binder on the table. It was a step-by-step playbook, written by my father and Alistair Finch, for exactly this kind of scenario. It was a manual for my revenge. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. The trust contained a poison pill clause, a provision so deeply buried in the legalese that only a paranoid or incredibly diligent attorney would find it. The clause stated that if any party, including the lifetime tenant, attempted to use the land as collateral for any purpose other than the direct operational needs of the primary family business, Miller Construction, or attempted to sell it, then two things would happen automatically. First, the lifetime tenancy would be immediately and irrevocably terminated. Second, all assets, buildings, and chattel currently on the land would be forfeited to the trust itself. "Your son thinks he's borrowing against the land," Sarah explained, her voice humming with excitement. "But the moment that loan is funded and the bank files a lien, he won't just lose the right to the land. According to this, he will forfeit the entire company. The buildings, the remaining equipment, the company name, everything reverts to the trust. He will have committed bank fraud to secure a loan against an asset he doesn't own, and in the process, he will lose the very company he stole. It's a perfect, self-destructing trap." For the next week, we prepared for war, following the playbook to the letter. First, I had to maintain my cover. I had to remain the broken, defeated old man. I accidentally ran into David one afternoon near his opulent downtown office. I played the part perfectly, looking frail, confused, asking him if he could spare a few dollars for groceries. He was dismissive, annoyed, peeling a 20 from his wallet and pressing it into my hand with a sigh of condescending pity. "Take care of yourself, Dad," he'd said before striding away, confident that I was no threat. That $20 bill felt like a declaration of war. I taped it to the wall of my apartment as a reminder of his arrogance. Meanwhile, Sarah worked tirelessly. She prepared a series of legal filings, ready to be executed at a moment's notice. A petition to the court to affirm the trust's ownership of the land. A cease and desist letter to the bank that was issuing the loan. And a comprehensive complaint to be filed with the State Bar Association, detailing David's fraudulent conversion of my assets and his ethical violations. She also engaged a forensic accountant to trace the money. We needed to know exactly where every dollar from my life savings and the liquidation of my company had gone. The accountant's report came back 2 days later, and it was even worse than I had imagined. David and Melissa hadn't just put the money in their bank account. They had gone on a breathtaking spending spree. A new vacation home in Aspen. A Lamborghini for him, a Tesla for her. Lavish trips. Designer clothes. They had burned through nearly $500,000 of my life's work in a matter of weeks, all while their father and father-in-law was living in a slum. The final piece of the plan was the war bonds. We cashed them out. The final sum was just over $350,000. It wasn't the millions they had stolen, but it was the seed money for my comeback. It was my father's final gift, the war chest for the battle ahead. I didn't deposit it into a normal bank account. On Sarah's advice, I used it to establish a new legal entity, a trust of my own, shielded from any possible legal attacks from David. We were building a new fortress while he was busy decorating a palace built on a sinkhole. A week after my meeting with Sarah, her contact at the loan underwriting department called. "It's done," the contact said. "D&M Holdings has been approved for the $10 million bridge loan. The paperwork has been signed. We're funding it and filing the UCC lien against the property tomorrow morning." The bait had been taken. The trap was about to spring. Sarah looked at me across her conference table. "It's time, Frank," she said, her voice steady. "Tomorrow morning, your son is going to have the worst day of his life." The silence in that conference room was the sound of a universe collapsing. David and Melissa sat frozen, the architects of their own ruin, staring at the mountain of evidence that had just buried them. The arrogance that had been their armor was gone, leaving them exposed and shockingly vulnerable. Melissa was the first to crack. Her CPA's mind, so adept at calculating profits and losses, was now processing a different kind of balance sheet. One that tallied up years of prison time, professional disgrace, and total financial annihilation. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. David, however, was still fighting, his lawyer's mind searching for a loophole, an angle, an escape route where none existed. "This is coercion," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "You can't. We'll fight this. We'll say he was incompetent when he created this new trust. We'll say you coerced him." Sarah leaned back in her chair, looking almost bored. "Will you? With what resources? The bank has frozen your accounts. The vacation home in Aspen was purchased with funds directly traceable to your father's stolen pension, making it subject to seizure. The cars are leased. The $10 million loan that was supposed to be your war chest is now the primary exhibit in a federal bank fraud investigation. You have nothing. No money, no credibility. And in about 1 hour, when the state bar receives this complaint, you, David, will no longer be a lawyer. You'll just be a defendant." Every word was a nail in their coffin. I watched my son's face, searching for a flicker of remorse, a hint of shame for what he had done to his own father. I saw nothing but the terror of a cornered animal. He had never been sorry for the crime, only for getting caught. That realization was a cold, hard stone in my gut, but it gave me the clarity I needed for what came next. I had waited for this moment. I had imagined it 1,000 times in that lonely apartment. I had thought I would be filled with a triumphant rage. Instead, I just felt a profound, weary sadness for the son I had lost long before he had ever stolen a dime. I leaned forward, and for the first time since they had entered the room, I addressed them directly. "There is one way out," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Not a way out for you to win. That ship has sailed. But a way for you to avoid spending the next 20 years in a federal prison." They both looked at me, their eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. "This is not a negotiation," I continued. "This is an ultimatum. Sarah has drawn up a document. It's an irrevocable confession and a settlement agreement. You will sign it today. You will admit, in writing, to the fraudulent conversion of my assets. You will relinquish all claim to D&M Holdings and any assets it contains. You will sign back the titles to my primary residence and the other properties. You will cooperate fully in the unwinding of every transaction you have made in the last 3 months. Every dollar that can be recovered will be returned. The cars will be returned. The Aspen House will be listed for sale tomorrow, with the proceeds returning to my trust." I paused, letting the weight of the terms sink in. "You will walk out of here with nothing but the clothes on your backs. The same way you left me. If you do this, if you sign this and comply with every single term, I will ask Sarah to hold off on filing the criminal complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I will let you disappear and try to build a life out of the rubble you've created for yourselves. But if you hesitate, if you argue, if you even think about fighting this, I will have her make that call before you leave this room. And I will personally attend every day of your trial." Melissa began to sob openly, her face in her hands. David just stared at me, his jaw working silently. He, the master of contracts and clauses, was being handed a contract with only one clause: utter capitulation or total destruction. Sarah slid the agreement across the table. It was thick, detailed, and utterly merciless. "You have 1 hour to read it and sign it," she said. "I suggest you use the time wisely." I stood up then, my part in the proceedings over. "I'll be in my new office," I said, looking directly at David. The words were a final twist of the knife. Because my new office, the one I had established for my new trust, was on the top floor of a building directly across the street, with a perfect, panoramic view of the headquarters of Miller Construction. My headquarters. The legacy he had tried and failed to steal. As I walked out of the room, I didn't look back. The broken sounds of my son and his wife's weeping were not sounds of victory to me. They were the sounds of a necessary, painful, and final amputation. The part of my life that they had inhabited had turned gangrenous, and I had finally, surgically, cut it away. Now, the healing could begin. The Aspen House was sold. The luxury cars were repossessed. One by one, the fraudulent transactions were reversed. My life savings, or what was left of them after their spending spree, flowed back into my new trust. The largest transaction, of course, was the reversion of Miller Construction itself. By triggering the poison pill, David had not just lost the land, he had forfeited the entire company. One morning, Sarah and I walked into the company headquarters. The remaining employees, who had been living in a state of confusion and fear under David's brief and chaotic reign, were gathered in the main conference room. When I walked in, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then a ripple of applause started, growing into a standing ovation. These were people I had worked with for years, people I had mentored, people whose families I knew. They were my work family, and they were welcoming their patriarch home. I had to clear my throat several times before I could speak. I know there have been some changes around here, I began, my voice thick with emotion. But I'm here to tell you that Miller Construction is back. We're not just going to rebuild. We're going to build better. The sense of purpose that filled me was a powerful antidote to the poison of the last few months. I threw myself into the work, not with the frantic energy of a young man, but with the focused wisdom of an old one. I rehired key people David had fired. I renegotiated the contracts he had foolishly cancelled. I put out the fires he had set and began, brick by brick, to restore the company's reputation. I discovered that I didn't want to just go back to the way things were. The ordeal had changed me. I had been given a second chance, a gift from my father across time, and I wanted to honor it. I decided to pivot the company's focus. Instead of chasing lucrative but soulless commercial projects, we started focusing on community-oriented builds, affordable housing complexes, a new wing for the local hospital, a community arts center. I was building a legacy, not just a balance sheet. During this time, I heard nothing from David and Melissa. They had vanished, as promised. I learned through a third-party source that they had moved to another state, stripped of their licenses to practice law and accounting. David was reportedly working as a paralegal, and Melissa as a bookkeeper. They had fallen from the sky and landed in the world of ordinary people. A punishment I felt was more fitting than any prison sentence. One day, Sarah called me. "The final asset transfer is complete, Frank," she said. "The numbers are all in. I've prepared a final statement for the trust. I think you should see it." I went to her office, and she turned her computer monitor towards me. On the screen was the final, consolidated balance sheet of my new trust. There were the recovered savings, the proceeds from the Aspen house, the restored value of my pension, the current valuation of Miller Construction, now stable and growing again, and at the bottom, the value of the land itself, the land my father had protected. In the current market, it was worth tens of millions of dollars. The total number at the bottom of the screen was staggering, far more than the $4.2 million they had initially stolen. By trying to steal my life's work, my son had inadvertently unlocked the true vast wealth my father had hidden away, a fortune I never even knew existed. "Congratulations, Frank," Sarah said with a smile. "You're a very wealthy man." I looked at the number on the screen, but I felt nothing. It was just a number. The real wealth was the feeling I had every morning when I walked into my company, the respect in the eyes of my employees, the sense of purpose in my work. The real wealth was the freedom from the betrayal that had almost consumed me. "My father was a hell of an engineer," I said, more to myself than to her. He had built a structure that had not only weathered the storm but had used the storm's own energy to become stronger than ever. 6 months after I took back my life, a letter arrived at my office. It was a simple white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a state I didn't recognize. The handwriting was David's. My hand hesitated over the paper, a flicker of the old anger and pain surfacing for a moment. I almost threw it away. What could he possibly have to say that I wanted to hear? But curiosity, and perhaps a final, lingering ember of fatherly duty won out. I opened it. The letter was not what I expected. There were no excuses, no justifications, no lingering traces of arrogance. It was just two short, simply worded paragraphs. He wrote about the shame and the daily humiliation of their new life. He wrote about the silence between him and Melissa, a silence filled with unspoken blame. He wrote about seeing an old man who looked like me on the street and having to turn away, physically ill with regret. The last sentence was, "I know I destroyed our family and I don't deserve forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I am sorry. I am sorry for everything." I read the letter twice. Was it genuine? Or was it another performance, another calculated move from a man who had made a career of them? I found, to my surprise, that it didn't matter. His sorrow, real or feigned, was his own burden to carry. It had no power over me. My life was no longer defined by his betrayal. I folded the letter and placed it not in the trash, but in the bottom drawer of my desk. A final artifact from a closed chapter. Life went on. Miller Construction thrived. We broke ground on the new Community Arts Center, a project I was immensely proud of. I found a new joy in mentoring the younger generation of engineers and project managers in my company, passing on the knowledge and ethics my father had passed on to me. I found a young woman named Maria, a bright, ambitious engineer from a poor background, who reminded me of myself at her age. I took her under my wing, seeing in her the future of the company. I hadn't just rebuilt my business. I had found a successor, one chosen for her merit and character, not her bloodline. One crisp autumn afternoon, I was walking through the frame of the new art center, the smell of sawdust and fresh concrete in the air. Maria was beside me, pointing out a structural detail on a blueprint. Looking at her, so full of passion and integrity, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. I had lost a son, but I had gained a new kind of family in the people I worked with and the community I was helping to build. The legacy of Miller Construction was secure. That evening, I drove to the cemetery. I hadn't been back since Eleanor's funeral. I stood before her grave and my father's, the two of them side by side under a large oak tree. I laid a hand on each of the cool granite headstones. "Well, Dad," I said softly to the stone, "you were right. The foundation held." I told them everything that had happened. I told them about David's betrayal, about the trust, about the comeback. I told them about the arts center and about Maria. I spoke for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. I wasn't speaking to ghosts. I was reporting back to my partners, the two people who had laid the foundation of my life. As I finished, I felt a sense of release, a final closing of the circle. I had honored their memory. I had protected the legacy. My father had given me the plans, but I had built the victory myself. I walked away from their gravesites not with a sense of sadness, but with a heart full of gratitude. Gratitude for a father whose foresight had reached across 70 years to save me, and gratitude for the second chance I had been given. I got in my car and drove home, not to the empty apartment of my exile, but to the warm, welcoming house I had built, its lights shining in the twilight. The past was settled. The future was mine to build. And for the first time in a long, long time, I felt truly, completely at peace.